Why didn't the torpedo explode? That was the question in the sonar operator's headphones on October 30th, 1939. Wilhelm Zahn had just fired 3 torpedoes at a British battleship from 800 meters, practically point-blank range. You could not miss at that distance. The torpedoes had left the tubes smoothly. They had run on course. At least 2 had struck the target's hull. The sonar crew heard the impact, a distinctive clank transmitted through the water, unmistakable to anyone who'd ever listened for it. Then nothing. No detonation. No explosion. The battleship kept going. On U-56's bridge, the question turned into something else, something closer to despair, because Zahn was not the first German commander to ask it. He wasn't even close. By October 1939, Dönitz was already sitting on reports from his commanders about failed torpedoes. He had complained. He had been told the weapons were fine. The problem was pilot error. And then Zahn fired 3 of them into a ship that couldn't move fast enough to avoid them and came back with nothing. The torpedo that didn't explode is the real story of the early U-boat war, and it connects, in ways that history doesn't always show clearly, to the commanders who stopped attacking altogether. The G7E electric torpedo was the weapon the German submarine service went to war with in September 1939. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, 23 feet long, running on battery power, leaving no wake that a ship's lookout could spot. It had 2 detonation systems, a magnetic pistol designed to fire when the torpedo passed under a target's keel, and was triggered by the change in magnetic field, and a contact pistol designed to fire on direct impact. Either system should have been sufficient on its own. Both had serious problems. The magnetic pistol malfunctioned in northern latitudes, where the horizontal component of the Earth's magnetic field is weaker than it is at lower latitudes. The contact pistol required near-perpendicular impact. If the torpedo struck at an angle, the delicate mechanism of levers and rods could bend without triggering the detonator. And both systems were running underneath the target, because the depth mechanism was calibrated with test heads lighter than the actual warheads, meaning every torpedo ran deeper than set. None of these problems had been fully discovered before the war because the Torpedo Trials Command, under Rear Admiral Oskar Wehr, had not tested the weapons adequately under realistic combat conditions. Vice Admiral Friedrich Goetting, the chief of the Torpedo Inspectorate, had actually sent 2 warnings to Grand Admiral Raeder before the war began, warning that the torpedoes were defective. Raeder's staff ignored both. When the boats went to war, they went to war with weapons the Inspectorate's own chief had warned weren't ready. Dönitz figured out something was wrong almost immediately. By late October 1939, his commanders were reporting torpedo failures at a rate of nearly 30%. He went to Grand Admiral Raeder. He was told the problems were minor and the fault lay with inexperienced commanders firing at wrong angles. This explanation satisfied no one at the front. Commanders who had been at sea for years, who had made the same attacks dozens of times in training, were watching their torpedoes fail at targets that sat in the water like apartment blocks. And then, Zahn fired into the Nelson. U-56 was a small submarine, a Type 1 IC coastal boat with only 3 forward tubes. Not the kind of vessel that was supposed to be in this part of the ocean, encountering this kind of target. But there it was, the battleship Nelson surrounded by 10 destroyers, and the battlecruiser Hood, the flagship of the British Home Fleet, doing 9 knots through North Atlantic waters west of the Orkneys. Aboard the Nelson were 3 of the most important British naval officers alive. Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet; Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord; and Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, not yet Prime Minister, but the man who would become Prime Minister in 7 months. They had gathered on the Nelson, according to German intelligence reconstructed after the war, to discuss the sinking of Royal Oak and what to do about the security of Scapa Flow. Churchill's own memoirs dispute whether he was aboard on that specific date, and the record is ambiguous. What is certain is that Forbes and Pound were there, and that the loss of either or both would have had significant consequences for British naval leadership at one of the most critical moments of the war. Zahn threaded U-56 through the destroyer screen, 10 destroyers and hood, without being detected. He reached firing position at 800 meters from Nelson. In his own account, he described it as an ideal setup. The fan of the torpedoes sped away smoothly, as on a practice shoot. The sonar operators heard 2 impacts against the hull. The third torpedo detonated at sea, harmlessly, well clear of the target. 2 torpedoes had hit the flagship of the Royal Navy and refused to explode. Nelson kept going. The destroyers, now alerted by the detonation at sea, began sonar sweeps. Zahn ordered U-56 deep to avoid the counterattack. He sat in the dark as the destroyers searched overhead. That evening, when the ships were gone, he surfaced and sent a radio report back to German headquarters, listing what he'd found in the area: Nelson, Rodney, Hood. The report should have gone out immediately after the attack. U-58 was in the area and could have been vectored to a second attempt on the same targets. Zahn couldn't bring himself to send it. The depression he'd fallen into over the missed shot made the radio seem far away. By the time the message went, it was too late. Dönitz would later write in his memoirs that the failed attack on Nelson represented an exceptionally serious failure. But he refused to blame Zahn, writing that Zahn had delivered his attack with great daring when surrounded by 12 escorting destroyers, and was in no way to blame for the torpedo malfunctions. Dönitz instead noted that Zahn was so depressed by the outcome that I felt compelled to withdraw him for the time being from active operations and employ him as an instructor at home. It was a compassionate response, and it was the correct one. The torpedoes had failed, not the commander. Whatever uncertainty existed in October 1939 was removed by April 1940. The German invasion of Norway sent 30 U-boats to intercept British naval forces attempting to land troops and oppose the German landings. The submarines positioned themselves in the fjords and approaches. What followed was one of the most frustrating performances in submarine history, not because the commanders lacked skill or courage, but because their weapons were catastrophically unreliable. Commander after commander fired torpedoes at targets that sat stopped, aground, anchored, or barely moving. British cruisers were hit multiple times by torpedoes that struck the hull and failed to detonate. Transports loaded with troops were caught at anchor and walked away. At Narvik, German destroyers were sunk, while U-boats watching from submerged positions fired torpedo after torpedo at British warships and heard impact after impact with no result. The battleship Warspite and at least 9 destroyers entering Narvik harbour were hit by torpedoes from at least 3 different submarines. Not one detonated. Gwenter Prien was among the commanders whose torpedoes failed during the Norway campaign. He had entered Bigden Fjord and found troop transports at anchor, large, slow, easy targets. He fired. Nothing. He fired again. Nothing. He reported, afterward, in language that made clear how he felt about it, that his boat was not fit to fight. He was the Bull of Scapa Flow, the most celebrated submarine commander in Germany, the man who had slipped into the Royal Navy's home base and sunk a battleship. And he was sitting in a Norwegian fjord with empty tubes, having accomplished nothing. Dönitz's private diary from April 1940, recording the string of failures from his commanders, contains an entry that translates roughly as, "The material is to blame, not the men." He was furious, and he was right. The Kriegsmarine's subsequent assessment, conducted after the Norway campaign, concluded that if the torpedoes had functioned as designed, at least 1 battleship, 7 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and several troop transports would have been sunk. These are not hypothetical targets. They are ships that U-boat commanders had in their sights, fired at and hit. The metal-on-metal impact was recorded in the sonar operators' logs. The ships kept going because the detonators bent or failed to trigger or ran underneath the keel without the magnetic pistol registering the change in field strength. Grand Admiral Raeder finally convened a commission to investigate. Within a week, the new torpedo inspector, Rear Admiral Oskar Kumetz, telephoned Dönitz and reported that he had proved beyond doubt that the torpedoes were defective in multiple ways simultaneously. The contact detonator mechanism was fragile and failure-prone at non-perpendicular angles. The magnetic pistol misfired in high latitudes. The depth mechanism was calibrated for the wrong weight of warhead, causing every torpedo to run deeper than set. Where, the chief of the Torpedo Trials Command, was court-martialed and sentenced, along with 2 of his principal associates. Vice Admiral Gerting, who had warned Raeder before the war, was eventually cleared. His warnings had been ignored. Dönitz would write, "For the lessons one fails to learn during peacetime, one pays a high price in war." The immediate fix was a modified contact pistol. The magnetic pistol was eventually deactivated entirely. Commanders preferred not to use it. The depth problem required more work and wasn't fully resolved until early 1942. The weapons got better, but something in the relationship between German submarine commanders and their own torpedoes had changed in the fjords of Norway in April 1940, and that change proved difficult to undo. Think about what it meant to be a submarine commander in the first 2 years of the war. You have found a convoy, a difficult thing to do in the North Atlantic, requiring precise navigation, patience, and good radio intelligence. You have tracked it, positioned yourself ahead of it, waited for the right moment. You fire. You listen to the hydrophones. You hear nothing. Or you hear impact and still nothing. You fire again. Nothing. The convoy passes overhead, the screws of the merchants churning through the sonar frequencies, and the escorts begin sonar sweeps, and you go deep. And later, you surface and transmit a report saying you had found the convoy and attacked without result. The first time this happens, you blame the torpedoes. The second time, you blame the torpedoes. By the 5th or 6th time, something less rational takes over. You begin to question whether the next torpedo will work either. You begin to wonder if the attack is worth the counterattack. You begin, unconsciously, to find reasons to delay the decision to fire. The convoy is at the wrong angle. The escort is positioned badly. Wait until dark. Dive deeper first. Track it a bit longer. And then the convoy is gone. And you fired nothing. And the report you write in the war diary says you had contact, but conditions prevented an attack. This isn't cowardice in the way the courts defined it. It's something more insidious. A gradual erosion of the willingness to commit, built up from repeated experiences of committing and getting nothing in return except counterattacks and spent torpedoes. The men who developed it couldn't always see it in themselves. The war diary entries that Dönitz was reading didn't record the hesitation, or the internal debate, or the moment where the convoy was there, clearly visible on the hydrophones, and the order to fire simply didn't come. They recorded the outcome: no attack. Imagine it from inside the steel tube on a cold night in the North Atlantic in late 1942. You are submerged at 60 meters. The convoy is passing above you. You can hear the propellers through the hull without even using the hydrophones, a deep vibration in the metal around you. Your torpedoes are loaded. The geometry is reasonable. The sonar operator is giving you a bearing. Your first watch officer is waiting for your order, and something in your mind is running the calculation. It has run a dozen times before. What happens after? The fish leave the tubes. The explosion, if there is one. The sonar contact immediately. The destroyers turning. The depth charges. The long wait in the dark while the charges walk down towards you. The hull groaning. The lights going out. You have been through it before. You know what it sounds like. The convoy passes. You follow it for a while. The geometry gets worse. By morning, it's gone. Dönitz read every war diary that came back. He was one of the most analytically rigorous submarine commanders who had ever lived. He had driven his own submarine into convoy lanes in the First World War, developed the wolfpack doctrine from first principles, and could read a war diary the way a prosecutor reads a document, looking for what it omitted as much as what it said. What he saw in some war diaries after the torpedo crisis was a pattern he recognized: contact established, opportunity identified, no attack made, convoy departed. Zahn recovered from the Nelson Patrol and took command of U-69 in 1941. He was an experienced commander with demonstrated ability under pressure. He had proven he could find and attack targets. The Nelson shot proved that. What the Norway experience and the repeated torpedo failures had done to the fleet's collective nerve was harder to measure and harder to repair than the detonators themselves. On a patrol in late November and early December 1941, U-69 made contact with a lone freighter in heavy weather south of Greenland. Zahn tracked it on the surface for 2 hours, then attacked with 4 torpedoes. All missed. He ordered the submarine to dive, reload the tubes, and surface again. The freighter was gone. He made further contacts that patrol, received reports of targets in the area from headquarters, and returned to base after 39 days without sinking anything. Donitz's written assessment of the patrol was direct. Although opportunities presented themselves, the commander once again has had no success. This cannot be attributed solely to lack of luck. The commander lacks skill both in general operations and in attacking. He was specific about what he'd seen in the war diary. Zahn had found a convoy and followed it rather than attacking. He wrote, "Proper tactics would have been to head for the convoy at full speed and to decide on a daylight attack, or at the very least to have kept so close to the enemy as not to lose him, as was the case here." Zahn had watched a convoy pass and waited too long. The reasons: an accumulation of failed attacks, the memory of sitting in silence while destroyers hunted overhead, the rational calculation that a missed torpedo means a counterattack. On the Wilhelm Gustloff, the passenger liner converted to a troop ship, but his career as a submarine commander who went after targets ended on U-69's December patrol. The man who had almost killed Churchill never sank another ship. Hirsacker had no torpedo crisis to blame. He had come up through U-boat training at the top of his class, had served as first watch officer on U-64, and then on the famous U-124 under Schultz. One of the best-run submarines in the fleet, he knew what an attack was supposed to look like. He had made them himself. He took command of U-572 in May 1941 and made 6 patrols, 267 total patrol days. He sank 3 ships for 14,800 tons, all of them in the first half of 1942, when conditions were still relatively favorable for U-boats operating in the American operational zone during the Second Happy Time. By late 1942, the picture had changed. Allied defenses were improving. More aircraft, more escorts, better radar. A U-boat found on the surface faced odds that were genuinely different from what they had been 18 months earlier. On his 6th and final patrol, in the fall of 1942, U-572 was assigned to the Streitaxt Group. 10. Submarines. Positioned against convoy SL-125. A slow southbound convoy coming down from Britain toward West Africa. Between October 27th and November 1st, 8 of those submarines made contact with the convoy and sank 12 ships. The Streitaxt Group's attack on SL-125 was a significant operational success, demonstrating that wolfpack tactics could still work even as Allied defenses improved. U-572 was in the area. It attacked none of the targets. A few weeks later, the same boat was assigned to attack the troop convoys of Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, the largest amphibious operation since the First World War. The convoys that U-boat headquarters had identified as among the highest priority targets in the entire Atlantic campaign. 2 boats from the group sank 4 ships. U-572 attacked none. These weren't occasions where Hirsacker found himself far from the targets or in bad weather or facing overwhelming escort force. The other boats in his group were finding and attacking the same convoys. The boat was in the right place. The opportunity was there. The attack didn't come. When U-572 returned to port at La Palisse in December 1942, one of Hirsacker's officers reported him to U-boat headquarters. The charge was specific. On the final patrol, Hirsacker had deliberately spent most of the time submerged, where a Type 6C submarine was functionally useless for convoy warfare. He had falsified the boat's Kriegstagebuch, the war diary, to conceal how little he had attempted. The entries showed activities and positions that didn't match what had actually occurred. Hirsacker was relieved of his command on December 18, 1942, transferred to destroyer duty pending investigation, charged under paragraphs 84 and 85 of the Military Criminal Code, cowardice in the presence of the enemy. His court-martial was held in Paris in 1943. The charge of cowardice, one of the most serious in military law, required proof of deliberate failure under circumstances where attack was possible. Hirsacker's war diary, compared against the known positions of the convoys he had been assigned to engage, provided that proof. He was convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. Hirsacker was 28 years old. A friend smuggled a pistol into the naval prison at Kiel, where Hirsacker was awaiting execution. He shot himself on April 24, 1943. U-572, under a new commander, went down on August 3, 1943, northeast of Trinidad, after an American patrol aircraft found it on the surface. All 47 crew died. The character in the German film Das Boot, named Philip Thompson, brave, noble, haunted by the horror of combat, is loosely based on Hirsacker. The filmmakers made him a Knight's Cross holder. Hirsacker never received a combat decoration. He was none of the things the film made him. The torpedo crisis produced a specific psychological dynamic that Dönitz understood but couldn't fully reverse by improving the weapons. A torpedo attack required a commander to commit to a decision, to say, at this moment, with this geometry and these conditions, the attack is worth the risk of detection. The detonation failures of 1939 and 1940 had inserted a layer of doubt into that decision that couldn't be removed simply by court-martialing the torpedo inspectorate or issuing new detonators. Commanders who had fired repeatedly without result began to delay the commitment, and the delay tended to accumulate. This isn't the right angle. This escort is positioned badly. Wait until the next watch, until the convoy had passed, or conditions had changed and the opportunity was gone. Dönitz's response was systematic. He read every war diary personally. He wrote assessments after every patrol. When he saw contact without attack, he noted it. When he saw attack without result, he noted whether the geometry had been reasonable. He distinguished between commanders who fired and missed and commanders who declined to fire. The former could be trained. The latter were a different problem. He knew the fear was rational. He had been a submarine commander himself, had been sunk by a British destroyer in the Mediterranean in the First World War, had spent time as a prisoner of war. He knew what it felt like to sit in a steel hull while depth charges detonated in the water above. He had built his entire doctrine around the fact that if submarines stayed submerged and let convoys pass, the submarines were safe but useless. The whole wolfpack system required commanders who would surface, expose themselves, attack. Every measure of the Atlantic campaign depended on commanders making the decision to attack when conditions were difficult, not just when they were ideal. Herbert Werner, who served as first watch officer on U-230 during Black May in 1943, described the experience in his post-war memoir as one of sustained dread that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. He wrote of the psychological pressure of knowing that every sortie in late 1943 felt less like a combat mission and more like a death sentence, that the men going out were aware, in ways they couldn't fully articulate in the moment, that the arithmetic had turned against them. Werner was one of the very few experienced officers who survived the entire war. He estimated afterward that by the end, Only about 24 captains, who had commanded submarines, remained alive. He noted that many of his closest friends had gone out on patrols from which they simply hadn't returned, their boats sending a final radio transmission and then going silent. By 1943, the conditions were rarely ideal. Air cover had extended across most of the North Atlantic. New radar saw through darkness and fog. Huffed-up equipment on convoy escorts gave a bearing to every submarine that transmitted a radio signal. The men who had joined the U-boat service in 1942 as replacements for the veterans lost in the early years of the campaign were less experienced, less confident, and making their first patrols into waters that had already claimed a significant fraction of their experienced predecessors. The question, why didn't the torpedo explode, had been answered and fixed. A new question had replaced it. Given everything I know about what happens when a submarine attacks a well-defended convoy, is this particular attack worth it? The numbers in May 1943 answered that question definitively for Dönitz, if not the way he wanted. 41 submarines sunk in a single month, a casualty rate of roughly one boat for every 100,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk. The calculation had been reversed. In the first happy time of 1940, the ratio had run the other way. Every submarine that went out came back, and sometimes it sank 3 or 4 ships while it was at it. By May 1943, the Germans were losing a submarine for every meaningful attack. Dönitz withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic convoy lanes on May 24, 1943. Not permanently, he brought them back with new equipment, new tactics, new weapons. But the battle, as it had been fought since 1939, was over. The commanders who had learned to hesitate had been right about the odds. The war diary had to say yes, not because the outcome could be guaranteed, but because the campaign required it. And then it stopped requiring it because the campaign was effectively lost. Wilhelm Zahn survived the war. He served in various capacities: training, shore duties, occasional surface command. On January 30th, 1945, he was one of 2 commanders who oversaw the departure of the Wilhelm Gustloff from Gdynia, a converted passenger ship carrying as many as 10,000 people, mostly wounded soldiers and refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. 3 torpedoes from a Soviet submarine sank the Wilhelm Gustloff that night in the Baltic Sea. An estimated 9,000 people died, one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Zahn came under criticism after the war for decisions made that night, specifically for raising a flag that submarine doctrine required him to lower near a combat zone. He maintained that he had followed correct procedure. He died in 1976 in Hamburg. Think about the arithmetic of his war. In October 1939, he had 3 torpedoes strike Winston Churchill's ship at 800 meters and watched them fail. He was not to blame. In December 1941, he followed a convoy and didn't attack it, and was removed from submarine command. He may or may not have been to blame. The difference between those 2 failures, one caused by defective engineering, one by a failure of nerve that defective engineering had helped create, is the story of what the torpedo crisis actually cost. Not just the ships that weren't sunk in 1939 and 1940 when the weapons failed. The commanders who came through that experience and were never quite able to make the decision quickly enough again. Who found themselves on a cold night in the Atlantic with a convoy overhead, running the calculation one more time, waiting just a little longer, and the convoy passing. Some things, once they're broken, don't come back clean.